case, Commissioner Benvenisti and Commissioner Fielding will ask 5 minutes worth of questions.
Mr. Brill, I'm quite interested in the fact that you have, in the course of the past year or so, spoken to people who are on the front line of protecting the United States in the post-9/11 environment, and have not limited yourself to those who are in supervisory positions or at the very top of the agencies. You state that it is necessary to demonstrate our support for these individuals whose view is in the long term rather than in less optimal kinds of supervision that Congress and others are able to maintain. How would you coordinate that kind of, or conform that kind of appreciation for those who are dedicated to protecting this country with the kind of accountability and review that is also necessary for us to conduct so that we may inform our recommendations at the end of the day with a body of information that not only provides a historical record, but provides a baseline for our recommendations?
I think that's the challenge. I don't want to minimize that challenge. Indeed, if I just sat here and said, well, you know, you need to have as many whistleblowers as possible come and sit at this table and tell you what's wrong with each and every federal agency, that would be much too simple. A lot of whistleblowers just have gripes that relate to labor problems or their own personal problems. You know, they haven't been promoted or they're just unhappy. All organizations have that. So it's not simply let the whistleblowers speak. It's much more trying to set, just to give you an example, if Washington says that the ports are safer, and by the way, the ports are safer, and the 2% number is a fiction. They are inspecting a much higher ratio of the truly dangerous cargo, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. But the people who deserve the credit for that are not only Bob Bonner and his team in Washington, but the customs inspectors on the port that I sat with here in New Jersey and in other places, who devised their own factoring system so that they could take a container and have notice of a container and decide which ones were the high-risk containers. And they, what happened was that in Washington, they consulted with those people and they said, you tell us what should be in this list of 100 or 200 factors that we should look at. You guys have the experience. There are some agencies that do that. There are other agencies that don't. If you want a sweeping generalization, I can give you one, which is customs good, INS bad. There is nothing, there is no deadline the INS has ever had in the memory, in anyone's memory in this room that they've ever met. There is nothing they've ever said they're going to do that they ever did. And I keep kidding my friend Tom Ridge that that's now your problem, and I can't wait to see how you solve it, because a lot of people, including some of the people at this table, such as the former Deputy Attorney General, have been in charge of solving that problem and haven't solved it. But the way to do it is, again, to try to take the politics out of this, because it's easy for a senator to say you're not spending this much, you're not spending enough money on this because you can never spend enough. And it's easy for the people in power to hold press conferences and say, we're doing this, we're doing this. They're right, they are, and they're well-motivated, sincere people. The issue is, we don't care what you say. What we want to know is the port X% safer today than it was last month? Is general aviation any safer? The way Washington has solved general aviation, the issue is you can't fly into National Airport. That's the one thing they've done that the gentleman here didn't talk about. That's the only safety measure so far for general aviation. You can't fly into National Airport. There've got to be other standards you can set for that, and it just ought to be productivity standards. This management goal, did you meet it, did you not meet it? And that takes a nonpartisan group, like the group assembled here, that can issue reports to the country the way we get, economic reports every quarter. We're this much safer here, we're not safer there.
Just to follow up,
I just want to get Commissioner Fielding in because we only got about 2 minutes. Lots of questions.
I just want to thank you for sugarcoating your comments about the INS.
Actually, they were sugar-coated. I think.
I'm sure they were.
No profanities or anything, you know.
Just a kind of a follow-up, and since we are short on time, one of our tasks is to try to figure out what's the best way to proceed every day as we go forward, because we get a little bit of information, then we get a little more, and we try to put it all together in some sort of a mosaic. But we have hearings like this, but people come in and they're limited by the time, by their statements and that sort of thing. So we're very free and easy to ask of people such as yourself if you would stay with us and cooperate with us as
I
we
would
go
love,
forward.
this is a particularly bad day for me today.
No, I understand that. and
I'll spend all day, any day.
Well,
to help you with
because
this.
you obviously have a list of people or categories of people that we could learn from as we go forward. We don't intend to only speak with the people in charge
No,
of
and
Mahogany.
I certainly didn't mean to imply that either.
No, I understand that. And so if you could do that, and the other thing which I think we could call upon you is obviously goals and standards could be the same management issues as anything else. We have to figure out and prioritize goals and standards so that we may have goals for bus traffic, but we might not have goals for
Exactly.
taxis. And there again, I would hope that we could call on you as we work our way through this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now, if I can, thank you very much, Mr. Brill.
You're welcome.
Go on, Mr. Wermuth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, distinguished members of the panel. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. As many of you know from other positions that you've held, RAND has been doing terrorism research and analysis for now more than 35 years. We have some of the leading experts in the country who have been involved in that process for a long time. In fact, at least one and perhaps more will appear before this panel in the coming days. I'm going to talk primarily about the work that we've been honored to do for the last 4 years now in providing the research and analytical support to the advisory panel to assess domestic response capabilities for terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction, also euphemistically known as the Gilmore Commission. From the written testimony that I've submitted, you'll see the congressional authority for the creation of that panel and its specific congressional mandate, a lot of information on the composition of that panel, and why many people think that panel is unique, primarily because it's made up of men and women who represent the first responder community, people in law enforcement, fire services, emergency medical services, public health, as well as people who have Washington experience in intelligence and military affairs and other matters. This panel lost one of its most distinguished members in the attacks of September the 11th, Ray Downey, Deputy Department Chief, Chief of Special Operations of the Fire Department of the City of New York. Of course, the incident commander on the day of those attacks died in the collapse of the North Tower that morning. You will see from the written testimony in considerable detail that this panel has been very consistent from its inception, and long before September 11th, 2001, it submitted its first report to the President and the Congress in December of 1999. It has now submitted 4 and will submit a 5th in December of this year before it goes out of business. But throughout its deliberations and its policy pronouncements to the President and the Congress, it has consistently adhered to the view that intelligence is key to this entire effort, and that the proper organizational structure, the proper coordination of intelligence collection, analysis, and dissemination, not only within a few select federal agencies, but even with state and local response entities, and now what is becoming increasingly obvious is that perhaps key elements of the private sector have to be included in that process. that getting the intelligence piece right is paramount to everything that we do. Prior panelists, I'm sure others on this panel will continue to note that we are infinitely vulnerable. We cannot defend against everything. We cannot secure and protect against everything. The importance of intelligence and getting that intelligence into the hands of people who need it is critical to all of our efforts. And the nexus between intelligence and law enforcement is also critical. And having people both in the pure intelligence world and the law enforcement world understand and appreciate what the other parts of all of that effort really mean. This panel started in 1999 and throughout its reports have made significant substantive recommendations about both structure and process for improving our intelligence collection, analysis, and dissemination efforts. In December of 2000, in its second report, it recommended the creation of an entity in the Executive Office of the President, similar, though not exactly, to what eventually became the Office of Homeland Security under Tom Ridge. As part of that recommendation, this panel said we need a better structure. We need a coordinated intelligence effort that brings together all of the agencies as well as state and local response entities to have a more complete, a more comprehensive, a more effective way of gathering and disseminating intelligence information. In subsequent reports, the panel has continued with those themes in ways to improve some of the specific pieces of intelligence operations. In its most recent report, and that is also detailed for you in the written testimony, and we've also provided copies of that report to the Commission staff for each of you to have. The panel recommended the creation of something that it called the National Counterterrorism Center, an all-source intelligence fusion analysis and dissemination center that would be comprised of pieces of the various agencies directly involved, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Justice, other components of the intelligence community, to bring together all of the raw intelligence data, if you will, and to try to make some sense out of that in a comprehensive fashion, to include in that process representatives of states and localities that would also help to inform through their resources all the way down to the local beat cop on the street, and to develop the best possible intelligence products for dissemination to people who have a need to know that information. The President announced in his State of the Union address something called the Terrorism Threat Integration Center, something similar to what this panel had recommended 2 months before, not exactly the same, and I'll be happy to address the differences between what this panel recommended and what the President has called for. But needless to say, this panel was focused on this and a number of other issues that you can see in our reports long before September 11th. It has been open and unabashed about its policy recommendations. One of the things that it has said consistently, with all due deference to the former United States senators and the 2 former members of Congress on this panel, that Congress still doesn't have its act together. It's getting better, but for a long time was not willing to organize itself in a way that would address these issues more effectively. At least the House of Representatives has now started doing that. With that, I'll complete my oral remarks by thanking you again for the opportunity to be here and to offer this commission any assistance that this advisory panel can provide to you, and of course anything that the RAND Corporation and any of its components can do to help you with your very, very challenging tasks in the months ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Wermuth. I have a feeling we'll be taking you up in that offer. Zoe Baird.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. We all, in our small way, hope that we can honor the memories of the victims of 9/11, and we thank you for giving us this opportunity to contribute to your effort to do that. I have a few comments I'd like to make, but I must say that my contribution to this commission is already so large that there's not, anything else I say will be purely redundant and additive, because you have the privilege of having the executive director of the Markle Task Force now as your executive director, and that will be the most important decision you've made. So I commend you, and if I can help in other ways too, I'm happy to. Our task force was focused on the use of information in order to prevent terrorism and protect the national security. In 9/11 exposed for worldview what was already well known in Washington, that we needed to reform our intelligence and information systems in order to deal with new threats. I had the privilege of serving in 1995 on a congressionally created commission on the future of roles and missions of the intelligence community. And at that point in time, there was no mandate from Congress to look at terrorism or weapons of mass destruction. We added it to our agenda, but it wasn't in the public debate as an important future role for the intelligence community. And that's of great significance, because we had several years which would have been terribly important to develop the capabilities we need to protect the country, in which we didn't do that, where we had few people who spoke the languages we needed to understand, where we didn't begin to think about the revamping of the very essence of how we do business in intelligence and information sharing, but instead we tried to patch a system that was designed against a singular state enemy instead of trying to understand the new enemies and emerging threats. And I think that you can't fail to look at that as you do your work, because you need to know what we have to do differently now. There's a great deal of discussion in Washington about the need for every agency to invest in filling these stovepipes with more information, or in connecting the dots and connecting information between agencies. But that is the same debate that we had about revamping the intelligence community in 1995 and 1996. It is using the same model of how we've always done business to say we should be able to do more of it. And the current need is radically different. You've heard from a number of people about the need for information out at the ends of the system, if you will, with state and local responders, with police, with firefighters. You know the numbers. You know there are 11,000 plus FBI agents, and there are 50 times that in terms of state and local law enforcers. And what do we want these people to be doing? What is their role in the system? We don't, in this country, want a system which will make all of those people in the UPS truck drivers intelligence agents. We're not looking, our country isn't worth protecting if it becomes a police state where everyone is collecting information and putting it into massive databases that we can then run programs against in order to find out who's doing what. But we do need to develop a system which moves the information to the people in local communities who need it when they need it and what they need, not everything, but what they need. And we need to have a system that pulls that information into central places in the federal government when it's needed for the purposes that it's needed. And that system, our task force, which was composed of one of the eminent members of your panel, Senator Gordon, as well as a whole range of people with experience both in Washington and intelligence and on the Hill, as well as people from the state and local governments, and quite a number of people from the information technology community. We looked at this problem when we said the system can be built in a way that both enhances security and protects the privacy and liberty interests, as long as those two interests are the key design elements for the system, and it's built together. That the system can be built with existing technology. This is not a matter of creating substantial new technologies over a long period of time that are more sophisticated and do more. In fact, a great deal of what we want to be able to do is already done in the private sector. So the question then becomes, how do you construct the system in a way that is comprehensive in the reach of who can participate in it, but not undermining of the civil liberties of the people about whom you collect information. Our conclusion is that the essence of doing that is that the president has to develop guidelines for creating the balance between privacy and security, and that there needs to be a public debate about what the criteria should be for those guidelines. We made a number of recommendations in our report, but your forum may be a very good one in which to inspire the public debate, because as Steve Brill was saying and others, unfortunately, we still swing wildly and polemically from the protect security to the protect privacy sides of this spectrum. And it doesn't do us any good to have a unanimous resolution passed to shut down a program on privacy grounds, and then to have actions taken by the Attorney General without consultation on security grounds. We're swinging back and forth in a way which won't enhance security, and we're doing it in a political environment which is going to leave people sitting here a year from now when you report feeling no more secure than they do today. We couldn't possibly harden all the targets. I mean, this is a refrain you will hear from everyone. Even if you have even if you pursue the kind of management tool that Steve was talking about, which seems very, very sensible, you will still not be able to harden all the targets. So what do you need to do? You need to have an information system that enables you to know who it is that's in the country who is hostile and might be inclined to undertake these actions, and when does that hostility merge with the capability to actually carry out an action so that you have a real threat to the country. And that is an information challenge. People who are hostile do us no harm unless they also have the capability to act. You need information on both sides of that, and you need to understand when those come together to actually create a threat. We know that if we had used the information we already had on 9/11, that there's a great deal we would have learned, that 2 of these terrorists were on the INS terrorist watch list, that they had common addresses and common frequent flyer numbers with other terrorists. Now, out of the vast amount of information, even if we'd had the kind of systems we talk about, could we have prevented that attack? I can't tell you that we could have, but we could have felt much, much better about the role our government plays in protecting our citizens, which is one of its highest callings. And therefore, it seems to me that as we are looking at what we need to do in the immediate term, we need to have the public debate that talks about the balance between privacy and security. The president needs to develop guidelines which will govern the federal government and inform the state and localities. And we need to, in addition, invest in state and local governments being part of the system, because the funding isn't there for them to participate. There's some very good people doing good work in their local areas, but they don't have the guidelines that empower them and constrain them, and they don't have the funds to undertake what they need to pursue. So with that, I'll close my comments and be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Larsen.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members, at the Institute for Homeland Security, we've been working on this specific topic for about 3 years. We're just about ready to finish and submit a report, which we will provide copies to this committee, because it will not be released to the general public due to the sensitive nature. We've focused on intelligence and law enforcement, but somewhat non-traditional perspective. We got together 15 senior people from each of 4 communities: law enforcement, intelligence, public health, and agriculture, to look at how they could better share information. Food supply is a great concern in this country about how it could be attacked. We discovered there were great cultural barriers to that. It took us about 6 hours to figure out what business casual meant with that community at our first offsite. When the word prevention came up, we found out that people in the intelligence community have a completely different definition than people from public health or agriculture. In the Department of Defense, where I spent 32 years, we have the DoD Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms. So we all know what the term general war means. You may not agree with it, but that's what the Secretary of Defense signs. That does not happen in the interagency community. But we will be happy to provide a copy of that, and I think you will find it interesting. I submitted my comments last week, so I will not repeat them, but I will highlight 3 issues from there. I see that from the letter that I was sent from this commission, it says you're chartered to prepare a full and complete account of the circumstances surrounding the events of September 11th, 2001. As a taxpayer, I would prefer that you focus on the future, not the past. If this commission were beginning 1 month after 9/11, that might be valuable. I have seen so many changes, I'm not sure of the value looking at the old system. When I say you should focus on the future, I'm not talking about next year, because you're not going to fix it in the next year for what we need in the 21st century. I think your focus should be out around the 5-year point about what this country is going to need. I think there are 2 alternative futures for the day you release your report in, I believe, May of next year. One of them will be there will be no new attacks on the American homeland, and the American people in Congress will expect a certain sort of recommendation from a commission that is operating in that environment. The other alternative, I think, is we could have had several attacks, perhaps major attacks, perhaps even an attack with a weapon of mass destruction. And I think the American people in Congress would expect a completely different recommendation from this committee. I think we all understand that 9/11 was not what changed everything. It's the technological revolution as what has changed the threat to our homeland. Because of the technological revolution, small nations and small, well-financed terrorist organizations can threaten our survival in this country. That is the scenario you must work with, because that is going to happen whether it's next month, next year, or 5 years. We know there has been a fundamental change in the international security equation, and that's what you must deal with. We did an exercise last November. The John Hamry from CSIS and myself led Silent Vector. It was the follow-on to Dark Winter exercise that we did 18 months ago. And I've given you a handout from Silent Vector, and once again, I apologize because we cannot release this to the public. It's not classified or anything, but we think it's sensitive and we don't like to provide terrorist information or that would end up in the newspaper or something. But what we discovered when we were working on this exercise was it was an unusual exercise. Senior leaders, Sam Nunn played the president, Jim Woolsey played Bill Sessions, former FBI director, Governor Gilmore played the governor of Virginia. The attack never occurred in the exercise. It was about specific and credible intelligence information coming in, and we wanted to see, John Hamry and I wanted to see where we could force them to make decisions that would have enormous economic impact, perhaps more than even the attack itself, what they would do. What we discovered in the 6 months we were preparing for the exercise was there was no system in the federal government today, no organization that looks at intelligence information that flows in, law enforcement information, and vulnerability assessment, and puts it into a fusion center, or some people like to say an integration center, to look at all this, and then combine that with the sort of data mining capability that other panel members were talking about, that could then provide real-time information to senior elected and appointed officials about how to use their limited resources. If you're the president, or you're a governor, a mayor, or a county executive, how do you do that? I spend a lot of time talking to mayors and chiefs of police. 2 weeks ago, I was talking to the Sheriff's Association of Illinois, and I said, how would you know what to protect in your county if I told you there's a specific threat? Where's your big vulnerability? With a chart like this, and this is rather simple, that just 8 people put together over a few months, but I mean, there is no organization doing this. Now, the NIPSI, that I know your commission that you worked on for a while, was somewhat focused on the cyber aspects of it, and it was a good model because they did look at all sorts of intelligence information, law enforcement, but I don't think the vulnerability assessment covered enough of the physical. But when you look at this, we came up with some very specific information. If you only have limited resources to use your National Guard or state troopers or whatever, it gives you an idea where you better go. And this integration center we're talking about is also not only valuable for prevention, it's also valuable how we're going to spend the money for mitigation and response. This sort of center could provide that information on vulnerability assessments, what the threats are, what the capabilities are, what the intentions are, so we know where to spend our money. Because my bottom line in the whole thing about Homeland Security, and I began studying this in 1994, biological warfare is what brought me into the Homeland Security business. My greatest threat, even though I'm very worried about the future of genetically engineered biological weapons, which I think is a very serious threat, nuclear weapons, cyber weapons, you name it. The one that I fear the most is uncontrolled spending. If we do not establish the right priorities, we will spend ourselves into bankruptcy like the Soviet Union did in the Cold War. 7,500 miles of border. Are we going to spend billions on building a Maginot Line along our border when Ramsey Youssef in 1993 attacked the World Trade Center with a bomb built across the river. Timothy McVeigh built his bomb in Kansas. When Aum Shinrikyo made their sarin, they made it in Tokyo, a few miles from where they attacked. The only weapon you need to bring across our border is a nuclear weapon. You don't even need to bring a radiological dispersal device across our border. I saw a picture in a newspaper the other day, one of these scanners that looks at the shipping containers. The X-ray uses cesium-137. That's one of the best things to use for a radiological dispersal device. You just put the bomb in the container. You don't even need the radiological material. It's in the X-ray machine right there at the port. But my point is, we cannot build a Maginot Line. I'm concerned about setting priorities, and I think that's the most valuable thing this commission can provide the American people, is a sense of priorities on this information integration center that will help not only for prevention, but mitigation and response. That information will be most important. It'll be the best investment this country can make in security. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Larsen. Commissioner Benveniste and Commissioner Fielding.
Well, let me first turn to Mr. Wermuth and Ms. Baird. First of all, we're very grateful for your contribution. You have submitted very important materials that go far beyond your oral presentations today, and we thank you for those and for your pledge of cooperation, which we will take you up on. To comment very briefly on Mr. Larsen's observation as a taxpayer, we are charged by our statute to investigate the circumstances of 9/11, but we are not starting from September 12. We are building upon the very good work done by the Joint Inquiry and other entities which have investigated that, and our mandate is to use that material as a jumping off point to conclude the investigation, hopefully to provide a definitive review of what went wrong on September 11th that will withstand historical scrutiny. But we're not going to reinvent the wheel, and please be assured of that. Both of you have talked about the balance between technological improvements for our security and the imperative of protecting our civil liberties. And there's obviously a great deal of tension between those two. And I'm interested that, Ms. Baird, you have suggested that this commission may be an appropriate forum for the national debate with respect to those perhaps competing objectives, protecting our security and yet protecting our civil rights. For it is quite clear that if we spend our days hiding under the table or afraid because of increased scrutiny on us that our civil liberties are gone, then our opponents will have won a victory just as easily as if, as Mr. Larsen has said, we spend ourselves into bankruptcy, as the Soviet Union did. So I would like to ask you to elaborate on what you view as the principal points between enhanced security and protection of our civil liberties.
The advisory panel has on more than one occasion used a quotation, I think, to describe how it feels about that issue, and the quote goes, "They that would give up essential liberty for a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." And that's Benjamin Franklin in 1759. This panel has been focused on civil liberties. It has said consistently the civil liberties of the citizens of the United States are really what make us unique in all the world. Nobody else has the kind of system and protections for civil rights and privacy considerations that we do in the United States. Having said that, the panel has articulated ways that we can use existing laws. We don't need significantly expanded laws, more intrusive capability. A lot of this is structure and process. It's simply taking things that we can already acquire under our laws, whether it's through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act or other court-supervised activities, or simply information that can be gathered legally in any number of other contexts. The idea is to bring all that information together and to fuse it, to use that term in the vernacular, to analyze it, to create some products out of it that make sense, and then get it into the hands of people who need to have it. This panel has been concerned, Randy mentioned, subsequent terrorist attacks. This panel's been concerned that we have an opportunity now to get this right structurally and process-wise. If we don't, the hue and cry from the American public, if it's still wrong when the next attack occurs, may cause that pendulum to swing too far, and we will feel compelled, or there will be public pressure to compel the government perhaps to be more intrusive, to chip away at civil liberties. And the men and women, at least of this organization, and certainly Rand's research has been articulate in that over the years, we don't want to do that. We want to find things that are consistent with the Constitution and consistent with the statutes that are on the books and the protections that we have, where we don't find ourselves under the kind of pressure of another attack or pending attacks where we do something that's not consistent with those values that we've held for so long, and make us then very much alike a lot of other countries who don't have the kinds of protections that we do.
I would suggest that there are two ways that you might look at this question. First of all, the development of guidelines are really the essence of striking that balance. And what I mean by guidelines are directives that make very clear for people in the system from Washington out into the local communities what it is that they can do and what it is that they can't do, what they are empowered to do and what the limits are on their actions. And right now we have a drive for unfocused collection of information everywhere, and then even less focused or less targeted oversight of the collection of that information. We have privacy czars, we have congressional oversight bodies, and everyone's trying to grab at what they think is the area where they need to limit what's going on. But the dynamic then that gets set up is those who have these weighty responsibilities, who don't want to be sitting here in front of you having failed when another terrorist attack occurs, are doing everything they can to use information to provide security, but they don't have guidance and accountability being assumed by policymakers for what it is they should be doing and what the limits are of what they should be doing. And so you have a system that really does not provide either security or privacy. And so these guidelines, we believe, are really the essence of making the clear determinations about what kind of information we need, who needs to have it, who should be providing it, and how that information moves in and out of those who need it, both in the public sector and the private sector. The other part of the guideline point that I would make is that a great deal of the information that we need to enhance security is in the private sector, and it's our belief that it ought to stay in the private sector and be drawn on when the government needs it. This is not necessarily popular in the private sector because it creates an obligation and a relationship with the government which doesn't exist in every part of the private sector. But where it does exist, in the financial services community, for example, it has been very successful and not unduly burdensome for the private sector, again, with very clear guidelines about what kind of information people in the private sector are required to retain, for how long, how it's accessed, and what their liability is for that. This, just again to be brief, the second point that I would make, that I would encourage you to look at, is the responsibility of the FBI in relationship to other agencies of the government. It's our belief that the FBI should do the compelled collection, if you will, the kinds of law enforcement collection of information that the FBI undertakes now, but that the FBI should not be the agency that is our equivalent of a domestic intelligence agency. We won't probably ever say we have a domestic intelligence agency, but in fact, the collection of information to inform policymakers, which is what intelligence is, as opposed to information that's collected for law enforcement, it's our belief should be driven out of the Department of Homeland Security. And that is for important civil liberties reasons, as well as the capabilities of different agencies, because if the people who collect the information are those who can take away your liberty by arresting you, then there is a greater threat to civil liberties from the collection of information by the government, and it's unnecessary given that we have to build this capability for the first time somewhere, so we concluded that building it at the FBI was not the right place, again, as part of that balance.
Well, we're going to drill down a little further on who gets the authority for the collection and dissemination, because I think each of you have different views about that. But just to follow up on this point, what I hear from both of you is that the means that we have available, presently existing, are sufficient, that there is no great need for some other silver bullet kind of intrusive collection mechanism, but rather the dissemination, the coordination was the failure. As we go forward and recognizing the imperative of individuals who are charged with guarding our homeland security and their natural response to the obligations they have, where do you see the point of where the rubber meets the road on the civil liberties issue? And where do you see it coming down?
Well, one way to look at that is the question of whether you need to collect information on individuals, or at what point do you need to collect information on individuals, and what kind of information. For example, if a police officer stops Muhammad Atta and needs to go to a database to find out about this person, he doesn't need to know everything about Muhammad Atta. He just needs to know not to let him go. He needs to know to bring him in so that whoever does need to have information about him is informed that this person where the red lights go off has been stopped. And so I think a very key part of the design of the system is to decide who needs to know what about individuals and who needs to know what about events or activities that they need to report to others. There are a lot of ways to, you probably get, news alerts on your email all the time. There are a lot of ways to move information around to alert people to things that are developing, or to have people understand that they have come across something that others need to know about without actually having to inform everyone in the system about everything. So I think that's a very important part of the design of the role of all the actors in the system.
I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule that you can apply to say something is or is not an encroachment on civil liberties that will apply in every context. Fortunately, the American people are not reticent about speaking up on things that they think are problems with their own privacy and liberty, as well as security interest. I mean, we all know those of us, and half of this panel, I guess, are lawyers by profession, and some of the rest of us who are here testifying, that with every civil liberty, with every civil right, there's a corresponding obligation. We are willing in a reasonable context to do things like going through searches of our person and our baggage when we go on airplanes because we know the security risks. So there are things that have to be applied in different situations, but I suggest it's a common sense rule. We simply need to be cognizant of not going too far in any context so that we encroach on civil liberties, but we're always going to be in that balancing act between security and civil liberties, and we just need to make sure that we try to address as many of those as we can in the calm between the storms, if you will, so that we're not forced into a situation of going overboard, as I said before, when the next attack occurs.
Mr. Larsen, you
Yes,
want
sir. In December, I met with some folks here in New York City Police Department, their intelligence organization, and they talked to me about a program you need to look at called advanced tip-offs. And it is technology that already exists, but they were asking if they could only have the funding to make it work. If that would have existed on the 5th of July in 2001, when the Florida State Trooper pulled over Mohammed Atta for speeding and punched it into the National Crime Information Center, it would have tied it to 17 different watch lists, everybody from Customs to IMS to DEA, CIA, and others. And as Zoe said, it would not say we want him for this or whatever. It would just say, don't let him go. I think the American people would have no problem with that. The technology can protect some of the privacy, but I think privacy is going to be one of the most important issues you're going to address. And it should be addressed when you have a year to sit down and do this, not the 2 weeks that it took to pass the Patriot Act, 362 pages that changed 17 laws. I haven't had time to read that. I wonder how many members of Congress read it and how difficult it is when it says change subparagraph C from and to or. That would take a tremendous amount of work. I doubt if any member of Congress read the entire Patriot Act. That's what this commission can do. And I think you also need to look at what are the real standards of privacy in this country today. We hosted a seminar at George Washington University, co-hosted with the Institute and the Elliott School a couple weeks ago, where we looked at law enforcement and intelligence. One thing, what's the new standard? One of the professors at George Washington recently made a trip to a conference in California, and as going to Dulles Airport, he realized he forgot his running shoes. Big runner. He said, oh, no problem, I'll buy some new ones. He's got a lot of miles on them. Checks into the hotel. He goes to the store and finds his running shoes he likes. He buys those. He sees a great pair of men's dress shoes on sale. Yeah, that's a pretty good price, and he buys that. Have you ever had it happen when your credit card comes back and says, a little bit out of the profile? Are you, what's your mother's maiden name or whatever that is? Well, this guy's a computer information specialist at George Washington University. So he asked the person on the phone, what made it pop out of your computer? He said 3 things. First of all, you never bought shoes in California. Okay, that's okay. You never bought 2 pairs of shoes in one day. You've never bought black dress shoes. Now, I'm not going to tell you which credit card this was, but one of those big credit cards out there knows that about you, too. Now, that sort of information would not be available to the FBI, but it would be to your bank card. What are the standards? I mean, we allow the banks to get away with that. I think you need to spend some time with folks in here very seriously talking about what new standards of privacy. We all lived in a small farming community where I grew up. We knew what everybody was doing, because we was a small community. We knew everyone. It's a different society we live in now, and I think you need to really spend some time looking at what those standards are.
Fred?
Obviously, that's an issue that we could go on all afternoon, but unfortunately, we're short of time. I would also like to thank you all for your cooperation and for coming here today and the tremendous paperwork that you've provided for us, which is going to be first read by those people and then by us, but we do appreciate it. I'm afraid we'll have to get on to really some of the organizational issues which are apparent from this topic. But it's been suggested to us in various ways that there is no real need for additional organization structure especially within the federal government, that the authorities that are needed for that exist, they're just not fulfilled. And I would appreciate your comments, each of your comments on that as an initial subject on the organizational side of this.
I think we would agree that in terms of the authority to conduct certain activities, as you'll see from the written testimony in connection with this National Counterterrorism Center, which to a certain extent has some of the characteristics that the President's initiative for the Terrorist Threat Integration Center in terms of fusion. The research that we did, the recommendation that the Gilmore Commission made for the creation of that center was not to create something new in addition to existing structures, but to bring pieces of other agencies together and put them in the same room, if you will, and require them to work together collectively, comprehensively, rather than working from some distance apart with all the cultural problems and other barriers that exist between and among federal entities. The panel said, take people that are already doing this and put them together. Don't create something brand new and in addition to everything else. We've got statutory authority, we've got existing capability, we've got expertise in these in compartments, but they're simply not together. Bring them together. We happen to say a little differently than what the Markle Foundation recommendation was. Don't put it in either Department of Homeland Security or the Central Intelligence Agency or any other department. Put it where it's truly independent and objective and honest broker, because there are a lot of customers. The Department of Homeland Security is not the only customer. The Central Intelligence Agency is not the only customer. The Department of Justice is not the only customer. Put it in a place where there really aren't the inherent pressures, if you will, and the competition for resources within an existing agency. Make it freestanding, objective, independent, but bring all the pieces together into that single location. That's what we said from a structure standpoint. And oh, by the way, we really don't need additional statutory authority other than the authority maybe to move the responsibilities for those from the agencies where they are into this other structure.
Ms. Baird?
Yeah, I would just say that I think that there's so much to be done to build on the existing capabilities and to create the activities that need to be undertaken, that I would put your focus there rather than putting your focus on thinking about new laws or new authorities, because there is a great deal of capability, legal authority and talent and agency commitment that needs to be developed, and that should really be the priority. I do think that the Department of Homeland Security has an important domestic role to play that you can encourage be played out by that department. It has quite a number of agencies in it that have a great deal of information that needs to be part of the system and that needs to be drawn on by the rest of the government and the locales. It also has the potential of being a single point of contact for much of the private sector information, which is not going to comfortably be shared with the CIA or foreign intelligence community. So as the Department of Homeland Security is ramping up, and much of the activity that was hoped for by those who passed the legislation on Capitol Hill is being pulled into other agencies other than the Department of Homeland Security or umbrella agencies. You might look hard at what you would encourage the Department of Homeland Security to be able to do, and particularly on the domestic front, what is important to have happen in an agency that is not under the direction of the Director of Central Intelligence. What will the American people be more comfortable having undertaken and be guided by a domestic agency as opposed to a foreign intelligence agency? And I think you've seen in some of the debates on Capitol Hill much more skittishness about the potential for privacy intrusions from the Defense Department or the foreign intelligence community than people feel about domestic agencies, and I would look hard at that.
But of course, the DCI exists as a concept. But is your feeling that that's just not a popular vehicle for doing this?
I don't think you will ever persuade the American people that the Director of Central Intelligence is a benign entity, because we have operated outside this country with rules we will not be comfortable applying inside the country, and he has been responsible for those operations. And perhaps 5-10 years from now, after the system sorts itself out and people understand comfortably how we can use information domestically to protect security, people will come to that. But I think that that will not be a comfortable place to have the leadership for domestic intelligence or information collection, particularly from the private sector.
Mr. Larsen?
I don't think this new organization that I would like to see fits under the Department of Justice nor the DCI. At one time, I thought it might fit under the new Department of Homeland Security, but I'm no longer sure now. Unfortunately, I think what John Gannon was trying to do over there got derailed. I think there was some potential there. Clearly, the Terrorism Threat Intelligence Center does not give us what we need. And clearly, we cannot have it under law enforcement. That's the part that I think the American people insist that we must protect the rights of the accused. So I think there are other models we can look at in other countries that could perhaps give you some vision here. But why my final recommendation here was I think you need to start with a blank piece of paper. The first time I went to visit the NIPSI, and I say NIPSI was a wonderful model that came out of PDD 39, the previous administration, where they fused those things together. But when you first walked in the door, the first day I visited there, they reached in and they pulled out their badges, and they were cops. And they admitted that only 14% of computer crime was reported because businesses didn't want to go to justice, because if you said there's been a computer crime and they came out and investigate, anything they found out could be used against you in a court of law. So we're going to have to remove it from justice and I think the intelligence community.
Well, now that raises a question I guess I really would like all three of your comments about too. We obviously had a historic role for the FBI. We had a historic role for the CIA. One was overseas, one was domestic. And the FBI is an adjunct to the Department of Justice. It provides the information for the Department of Justice. Their indictments come down. There's suddenly all the information goes into the black hole, and it can't be shared. It's grand jury information. It's law enforcement information, but it's being used in the adjudication of criminal cases, and therefore doesn't get disseminated. Now, how are we going to solve that problem in any of these schemes?
I think there is a model. The National Infrastructure Protection Center that's been moved to the new department, they looked at all source intelligence information, law enforcement sensitive information, which even included grand jury testimony. Mm-hmm. And with vulnerability, but like I say, once again, primarily focused on the cyber aspects of it. That model is there. It worked. There are certain things that take place in counterterrorism task force that also work. I agree. I don't think we need new legislation. I think we need new organization. I think General Eisenhower got it right when he said, you know, the right organization will not guarantee success, but the wrong organization will guarantee failure. And now we have the wrong organization. We need a new one.
Zoe?
Well, you have probably the leading expert on your own commission in Jamie on that question, so I won't even try to venture into how 6E information gets shared because she'll make sure you're straight there. But I would say something that is perhaps not responsive, but I think important, which is that if much of this information is not collected by law enforcement, if intelligence information, which is intended for policymakers, is collected through other means or under the direction of the Department of Homeland Security, then you don't put the FBI in the challenging position of deciding not to pursue its own rules. That you then have a policymaker who says, okay, this is what we know about this group of people. What policy action should be taken? Do we want to prosecute them to get them off the street? Do we want to deport them? Do we want to continue to follow them to see who they are working with outside the country or at other levels or in other cells? Do we want to engage in diplomacy with the country from which they came to try to learn more about what's going on in that country that could lead to a more substantial terrorist threat by virtue of the fact that we have this information on their citizens, and perhaps information about relationships between their citizens and others. So if you have in the first instance the information going to policymakers, and the policymaker can decide this is something that should go into that law enforcement box. And how black the box is today is a little grayer than it used to be, but as I say, Jamie's the best person to inform you about that.
Mr. Wermuth?
Intelligence collection for law enforcement purposes, investigation, arrest, and prosecution is, in our view, very different than intelligence collection, analysis, and dissemination for deterrence, prevention, and protection. We've said that in our reports that the FBI is the best law enforcement agency in the world. They don't understand intelligence collection and analysis at the strategic level. They do it for law enforcement, and it's different. And they protect it, as you have suggested, in grand jury testimony and investigations. That's one of the reasons this panel said, take the FISA collection responsibilities out of the FBI and put it into this reconstructed, this new design of capability in a standalone center. Let me offer an anecdote that I think is analogous. In a prior incarnation, I had something to do with counter-drug policy making and operations. In 1990, about this time of year, 1990, if memory serves, the Counter-Narcotic Center at the Central Intelligence Agency came to the FBI and DEA and said, could we see all of your files on Colombian drug operations? And of course, the answer that you might expect was, we can't turn over all our files. There are open investigations, there's grand jury testimony in there, we might taint evidence that would be presented in a court. So the CNC went away and scratched their heads for a few months and came back and said, okay, can we see all of your closed files? And after some agonizing with people in the Office of Legal Policy and Department of Justice and elsewhere within the structures, the Bureau and DEA turned over their closed files to the Counter-Narcotic Center. 90 days later, the CNC had mapped the Cali cartel to about a 95% level of assurance. That's the kinds of things we're talking about when we talk about strategic intelligence versus intelligence for law enforcement. It's a different situation, and this panel has said that they're not sure that the FBI would ever be able to change their culture to understand the difference in the two. And even if they could, it would take a new generation of FBI agents and leadership, despite all of the great things that Director Mueller and some of the senior people in the FBI are trying to do. It's an inherent culture in that organization that they do things for law enforcement purposes. They don't do it for strategic purposes for deterrence, prevention, and protection.
We've got 5 more minutes, I think.
With respect to the comment that Ms. Baird made in her written materials relating to agencies rushing out to collect information and technology on their own, resulting in a stovepiping of systems. We've seen the unfortunately named Total Information Assessment Office recently defunded. Undoubtedly, throughout the government, since there is this great infusion of funds thrown at counterterrorism, what have you observed in terms of duplication of efforts, duplication of funding, which perhaps we, in being on the scene in real time, observers of the situation, can perhaps influence in some way? And if we could, what would you have us do?
A great deal of funding is being put into the information collection capability for the government, but it is being put into filling up these stovepipes by and large. It's not being put into developing a system of sharing information at the federal, state, and local level. And so very little money is going into the intersection between agencies or between the federal and local and having the state and local governments be able to be part of the system. So I would encourage you to look at and to ask people to provide you with information about the dollars that are going to developing the systems of sharing and integration of a national system as opposed to filling the stovepipes of particular federal agencies.
I'm trying to find the exact site. The National Strategy for Homeland Security talked about the creation of something that it called the Collaborative Classified Enterprise. And that was supposed to be exactly the kind of stuff that Zoe was talking about, to link all of this together for both intelligence and information sharing so that you could get information to the people who needed to have it at the right time, at the right place. You could bring information that was gathered in appropriate ways into this collaborative enterprise. Collaborative classified enterprise was what the national strategy called it. We suggested that be in this new National Counterterrorism Center that the panel called for. It wouldn't have to be there, but it certainly needs to be, as Zoe said, a comprehensive, focused, prioritized mechanism for doing exactly what she was suggesting.
Well, I approach this with no preconception, but one of the things that we've heard a lot about and will continue to study is the question of whether this domestic intelligence collection enterprise is moved out of the FBI, where it basically now resides, and put somewhere else. Two things. One, you have this great aircraft carrier of the FBI turning. We're in the process of turning. They've devoted assets, they've retrained, they're trying to do what we're asking them to do. At the same time, there are suggestions that we should go to something like a British MI5 or the Canadian bifurcation or the French Sûreté, God forbid, or something else. Is there a suggestion from your collective experience as to one country which would be a model in a democratic country which operates in an efficient way that should be a model, at least in part, for us?
We deliberately, we looked at MI5 very closely, for example, but we deliberately stayed away from trying to draw a comparison with what this panel was recommending with the National Counterterrorism Center, including the domestic collection piece. In MI5, the simple fact is the laws are different. The concerns about civil liberties are different. The concerns about privacy are different. You might compare some structure just in terms of where it's located and who it reports to and who can task it and what some of the limitations are. But we finally came to the conclusion that there wouldn't be anything advantageous from making those comparisons because so many things are different. This panel said this is a U.S. problem, we need a U.S. solution, and that's why it recommended what it did without any artificial or arbitrary comparisons to the structures in other countries.
I would agree with that.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. Three commissioners have been waiting to ask questions, Senator Gordon, Commissioner Gerlich, and Senator Cleland. So fast questions and answers if we can.
Mine would take far too long, so I will defer to James.
All right. Well, thank you.
I couldn't even ask the question at the time.
Oh, dear. Well, we all want to hear that question at some point.
You will.
First, let me say to Zoe Baird and to the Markle Foundation, thank you for directing our attention to, A, the low-hanging fruit of engaging state and local government agencies and corporate America, and for teeing up the very important question of the balance between privacy and the efficacy of law enforcement and counterterrorism. My questions are primarily directed to Mr. Wermuth and Mr. Larsen, and they go to the question of efficacy of commissions. Mr. Wermuth, I would have thought that if you read your commission recommendations, together with the conclusions of the joint inquiry, which just after all looked at intelligence failures, but nevertheless, that it would have been sickening to you, because you recommended well before September 11, 2001, that we have a fusion of intelligence, law enforcement, immigration information, and that we engage fully state and local law enforcement. And when you put that together with what the joint inquiry said would have occurred in terms of the apprehension of leadership of those who perpetrated 9/11, that if you had gotten that information together, you could have apprehended those people, or possibly you could have. It's a very disturbing picture. And here we are, 10 commissioners, a very able staff, very able people willing to help us. And my question to you, as we are in this first public hearing, looking to the end of our process, is do you have any second thoughts about what you did with your recommendations? Are there things that we can learn about how to be more effective and have greater impact so that the scenario I just described wouldn't be repeated in the future?
It certainly is frustrating when you look at this from an historical context now to realize how many what now appear to be, prescient recommendations this panel made before September of 2001. But you've served in a major department of government at the highest levels. Others have served in Congress and as chief executives of states. You know the tensions that exist. You know the parochial nature of certain issues that exist. You know the politics, both with a little p and a big P, that often enter into deliberations of legislative bodies and executive branch agencies. That's not to say that any of that was not well-intentioned at the time. Our agencies do compete with each other. Our political parties compete with each other. Heavens, the two houses of Congress compete with each other. I think there is significant value in commissions just like the one on which you now sit, because you bring a wealth of information to the discussion without the constraints maybe that you once had when you served within a specific branch of government or represented a party in a particular House of Congress. You'll be able, from what we have learned, you will be able to be more open and honest and comprehensive and nonpartisan in a capacity like this than perhaps you were in positions in which you served in the past. And that's, to us, that's beneficial. That's not to say that you need to establish a national commission for every single problem and expect it to solve the problems. But you can have some impact. Of the 79 recommendations that our advisory panel made in its first 3 reports, 66 of them have been adopted in whole or in major part. So you can have an impact. That doesn't mean that you'll get all of the things right, but if you're a panel that's composed of the kind of people that are clearly on this panel with your expertise and national recognition, suffice it to say that your recommendations, and I dare say they'll be reasonable and logical and sound and supported by the evidence and everything else, you'll have an impact. You shouldn't be concerned about that. The only concern will be, can you do it fast enough to get them into play before the next events happen?
Thank you. I'd like to hear any
I don't
comments from
often
Mr. Larsen
disagree.
or Ms. Baird.
I don't often disagree with Michael. I'll disagree a little bit. We had a close mutual friend, Phil Coleman, when he sat down to be the director of the Presidential Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection. He went back and looked at a whole bunch of different commissions and what effect did they really have. It's pretty discouraging when you really look at the data out there.
Well, and he also, his commission, the Presidential Commission on Critical
Was one of the very
Infrastructure,
effective ones.
cataloged all of the vulnerabilities of each of the sectors in this report. And one questions what has happened to all that information, and is it being used?
Very good question. I know the NIPSI was very focused in cyber only, and the physical dropped off the scope. But I tell you, in January, a recommendation I'll have for you to how to get better action out of your report. Instead of, you don't want it to become shelfware, like so many do. Okay, another report, let's stick it over here. In January of 2001, Dr. Terry O'Toole from Johns Hopkins and I were terribly concerned about this country being vulnerable to an attack with smallpox, something we know that Iraq has, that could threaten the survival of the nation. Now, we could have gotten a small study funded by the Markle Foundation or someone, a foundation, and gone out and written a report and put it up there, and it wouldn't, and what would have done? What we did together was put together that exercise, Dark Winter, and then not so much the exercise, but how we took that 35-minute presentation in a dramatic format and sat down with Senator Warner in his office, with Senator Roberts, with Vice President Cheney. We briefed Vice President Cheney 9 days after 9/11 and said, this is what it means to this country only having 15 million doses of smallpox vaccine. Now, that was simple. It was very focused, one small issue. We got a $500 million program out of that, and the country is far more secure. There's another commission going on right now looking at another threat that has come to us and said, could you do a Dark Winter style thing for us to help us when we finish our study and our scientific work to put it together so we could take it around town and sit down either in congressional hearings or one-on-one with senior leaders and say, let us show you what it would be like if we have another serious threat coming to our country with the system we have now. Let us show you what it would be like if we had this new system we recommend. A dramatic 30-minute presentation like that is something that might help you market your recommendations.
Zoe, do you want to have a last word on that question?
No, I think enough's been said. Thank you.
Last question from
Yes.
Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick one. We may be getting lost in the weeds here. For the second day in a row here, I've heard distinguished panelists say there's going to be another attack. Mr. Larsen, you said that?
Yes, sir.
The gentleman here, and Ms. Baird. We heard that yesterday from an expert on terrorism who's been studying that since 1974, I think. That's very scary. Given the fact that what little we know about Osama bin Laden, and we haven't found him yet apparently, is that he generates his energy from the allegation that particularly America is overstepping its bounds, is taking, and has a footprint on Islamic lands. In Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and now we have a war in Iraq. I mean, are these aid to Egypt, aid to and a base in Saudi Arabia, the war in Iraq, are these actions by the United States more likely to produce the counterattack or this next attack, Mr. Larsen? I mean, what elements are there that make you think we're going to get hit again, and what would lessen those elements?
The fact that we are at war in Iraq today, in my mind, there's no question that it increases the threat of attacks on our homeland in the short term. However, if we were not at war in Iraq today and Saddam refused to disarm, I think the long term, the threat would even be more significant. We're not at war today in Iraq to make it safer this week or this month. I think it's try to make a safer international security environment for my children and your children and grandchildren. That's what it is. The international security equation has changed, as I said in the beginning, and with technology, small actors can seriously threaten us. And I don't think that, and it's not just Osama bin Laden, it's others, but you mentioned Osama bin Laden. He doesn't hate us for what we do in our foreign policy, I think, as much as for what we are and what we believe in this country, and that's not going to change. So I think we have to understand that. I hate saying that. I hate saying that to my kids and grandkids down in Texas, there's going to be more attacks, but it is a fact that we have to adjust to. It's going to happen.
Anyone else? Mr. Wermuth?
I happen to think that whether we were in Iraq or not, I mean, we said this clearly even before the current conflict started, that the likelihood, for all the reasons that Randy has mentioned, there are people out there, and it's not just Osama bin Laden, they're just people out there in the world who don't like us. And are likely now, because the mold has been broken and we have had significant terrorist attacks inside the United States, that others will be emboldened to do it. But I mean, let's face it, we had a what could have been a disastrous attack right down the street in 1993, and a lot of people said, better be paying attention to that. You need to understand what implications that has for the future. And some people listened, but not enough people listened. The operations in Iraq may do, as Hosni Mubarak said yesterday, create another 100 Osama bin Ladens, but I would suggest that any number of policies of this country, just because we do what we do, we are who we are, might just as well push some of those people over the edge into attacking us at some point in time. So I don't think that this country can stop taking decisive action when it's in the U.S. national interest to do that, as long as we have good grounding to do it, whatever it is, whether it's economic policy or military engagement or types of diplomacy or sanctions or whatever else it happens to be, just because we're scared of the next terrorist attack. And I know, Senator, that's not what you were suggesting, but I think we obviously have to take into consideration what reactions our actions may cause in other parts of the world and within other cultures, but we still need to continue to try to do the right thing wherever we have interest in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.